What happens before we go on air sometimes when I'm getting a chance to visit with our guest is just as much fun as what happens on air. So Mitch
Sure.
Kramer is going to join us. He's founder of Fluent Financial. The man understands what we're about to talk about. But before that, I think just positive vibes. Texas Tech is someone he wants to see make it to the show here. And so they made the Sweet 16. Let's see if we can't cross our fingers and help them out with that. Mitch, good to have you coming down the road with us.
Glad to be with you today, Joel.
Texas Tech got a good team?
Yes, sir, they do. If they can shoot, I think they're a contender. So offense is the Achilles heel.
Well,
defense, there's no problems.
Now I got a reason to cheer for them. I want to talk to you a little bit about medical collection debt. I want to tell you a story, Mitch. When I was young, Sue and I found out we were going to have a baby. We had a baby and we had little to no health insurance. We thought we had better health insurance than what we did. Ashley ended up in the ICU ward for 2 weeks. We were broke. And what they were going to charge us to take her home was basically more than we ever could have paid. So it was either bankruptcy or cut a deal with the medical provider. When I sat down with them and we figured out a payment plan, which, by the way, they didn't have to do, but they did, I stuck to it. And basically one day I got to burn the mortgage and say Ashley was all mine. That isn't true anymore with some of the people we talk to now. I mean, how do they deal with it now, Mitch?
No, it's much more difficult because a lot of the medical establishment is now true businesses. And if you go in for a procedure and say, how much is this going to cost me? No one can tell you how much it's going to cost you. So it's very opaque, and you've got the hospital bill, you got the doctor's bill, you got an anesthesiologist bill, you got a facility charge, and then you've got the whole issue, is this in-network, out-of-network, is this a copay, am I meeting my deductible? And most Americans aren't going to be engaging the medical healthcare system on a regular basis, so they don't know what they don't know. And what happens, and then the other part is, you think you've paid all your bills, 8 months later, a bill comes in that says, hey, you haven't paid this. And if you look at the credit bureaus, 58% of the delinquent notices are medical related. So the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau produced this act recently. I think is going to be very beneficial for a lot of Americans. That's going to help the credit. And as of July 1st, any medical charge-off that's been paid is going to be removed from credit bureaus. And going forward, anything under $500 will not be reported. And most of the negative credit numbers are bills below $500. So I think this is going to really help a lot of Americans.
So when you say it helps a lot of Americans, are we talking about the ability to go in, sit across the desk from a banker, and he looks at your credit report and says, look, you're not living off a system here. You're actually paying your bills. Or how can it help the average American?
Well, it's a really good question, Joel. Two things. First of all, the banks and a lot of your big finance companies, if you're buying a truck or car, they're going to look more at your car, truck, and mortgage history than you're paying your medical bills. And it's almost like the industry recognizes people are going to have, a medical issue on their credit report. We have 43 million Americans that have some kind of derogatory medical report on the credit bureau. But the other part of it is when these negative numbers start coming off in July, that's going to boost the FICO score. So the banker is going to look at the consumer's FICO score and say, hey, your credit maybe it was 625, maybe it's 670, 700. So it's a much different conversation, and also will lower the borrowing cost for the consumers because they're not going to have that notched credit report because of the medical entry.
But what about it being a tool to make sure people do pay their medical bills? What about the provider? When they look at all of this, did they just lose an arrow in their quiver so that they can't sit there and look at a Joel and Sue Heitkamp and say, look, if you don't pay us, you're going to have a bad credit report, where now they don't have that ability?
Well, kind of a sad story what the medical providers have done is a tactic called debt parking. And what debt parking involved, instead of trying to collect a debt, they would just notch a person's credit report, and recognizing when this person applied for credit next, it would show up on the credit bureau. Then they would go back to the medical establishment and pay the bill. Well, this new act prohibits that tactic from being deployed anymore, which is really, really helpful. I think the medical people are going to have to work a little harder than they have, and try to work with people to get them to pay bills. And one of the things that I advocate is anytime you have trouble paying a bill, if you can communicate with the person providing the good or service, they'll work with you. But I think too many Americans get busy. If you're trying to raise kids, go to school, work 2 or 3 jobs, you don't have time for this, but you got to make time to protect your credit rating.
Well, when I go back to what you just said, that has me nodding my head up and down, which is if you sit down and you talk to someone and you give them a handshake and they know that you're sincere and honest and that you back it up. I mean, that might have been 37 years ago. But that individual that sat across the table from Sue and I, they didn't have to do what they did. They didn't have to do it, but they knew that I was sincere in making sure that I would keep that payment and make sure then in that year and a half or whatever it took that I made those payments. Having that conversation though, sometimes, Mitch, can be a really hard thing to do when it's much more corporate now than what it was at St. Francis Hospital in Breckenridge, Minnesota. Can
Yes.
people even have that opportunity anymore?
I think that's a real big challenge, Joel, because so much of our business and call centers has been offshored to India or the Philippines or wherever else. And you're talking to someone who probably doesn't speak English as a first language and doesn't understand. And I don't know if we can really fix that, but if there's an attempt made, that's better than no attempt at all. And I don't have the exact numbers on this, but I imagine a lot of the medical debt is as a result of people weren't aware of it. And I think one thing is a kind of a good housekeeping measure. You should run have the credit agencies run a full credit report once a year, just to see if there's any notches on your credit report, to see if any of these bills get submitted. I just think that's really smart to keep your credit clean.
Yesterday I was going through an airport and I'm going to get a breakfast sandwich and I looked at the price and I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, my cafe back home in Hankinson would charge a fourth of that for something that was better than that. But the truth of the matter is I knew what it was going to cost me. I looked at that and I knew what it was going to cost me. And then I got to make a decision based off of that. In the medical community, you don't get that information. The average Joe or Jane out there doesn't know what it's going to cost you. They just know that you have no choice but to buy it. And I don't know how we fix that, Mitch, because that's a big part of the debt you're talking about.
Yeah, and again, I think in coming through COVID, and we could talk all segment about how our medical establishment, suppressed a lot of good information, but I think the medical establishment likes to keep things very opaque, so the average American really doesn't understand what they owe and what they don't owe and who pays what, and the insurance companies aren't much of a help. So I know we're regulated by the SEC. We actually have had to add language over the years that make it more user-friendly versus having legalese contracts. I think if something like that were to happen in the credit area, in the medical area, to make it more understandable, so like my grandmother could understand this, I think that'd be a step in the right direction.
So what happens from here? I mean, where does the industry look in 5 years, 10 years? As you look into that crystal ball and you see how healthcare changes, or is this something that's going to take congressional action, or is this something that the healthcare industry kind of reinvents itself a little bit based upon what they don't want to happen?
Yeah, really good question. I think anytime there's pain, there's a business opportunity. And I think the smart healthcare providers and hospitals are going to recognize that they can provide more transparent pricing, a much more streamlined process. They're going to be able to pick up market share. But they may need a nudge from the regulatory agencies. And I'm not a fan of the federal government getting in the businesses, but they may need to nudge these people along to move to that place, because with more AI and technology coming along, it's going to become more efficient, and hopefully some of this opaqueness will disappear.
Well, as the husband of an RN and a daughter that's a nurse practitioner, I can tell you this: it's all in our rural areas going to come down to people.
Yes.
That is such the big hurdle to get to. Mitch, you understand it better than anybody that could have explained it to me. I thank you for that. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Joe. Have a great afternoon.
Go Texas Tech. I'll be cheering for you.